Royal wedding anniversaries that end in divorce are not supposed to be marked at all. This year, a 13-year-old marked one anyway. There was no toast, no reissued photograph, no line in the court circular, nothing acknowledging a marriage that ended the way this one did. And then, the evening before the date, Prince George walked into a garden carrying something small enough to close inside one hand, and quietly did the one thing nobody in that family had done in almost 30 years. By the following morning, according to people close to the household, it had reduced two of the most composed adults in that palace, Prince William and Princess Anne, to tears. That is where this starts. Charles and Diana were married at St. Paul's Cathedral on the 29th of July, 1981, 45 years ago this week. And the thing you have to understand about that anniversary inside the modern royal family is that it does not exist, not officially. Since the divorce in 1996, the 29th of July has passed every single year in complete silence. No statement, no old photograph dusted off for the occasion, no acknowledgement of any kind. The family treats it exactly the way you would treat a marriage that ended badly and stayed that way. A private matter, closed, not to be reopened. That silence has held unbroken for nearly 3 decades. Think about what that silence actually is, because it is not an accident, and it is not neglect. It is a system. The palace has specific machinery for deciding which parts of its own history get remembered, and which get quietly allowed to fade. Anniversaries that serve the institution get marked. The coronation, the accession, the jubilees. They get the photograph, the statement, the line in the court circular. Anniversaries that embarrass the institution get nothing. No decree that they are forbidden. Just an absence. A collective practice. Looking away. Over enough years, an absence hardens into something almost as solid as a rule. Nobody at Kensington Palace has to send a memo saying not to mention the 29th of July. Everybody just knows. That is how institutions bury their own past. Not by locking it away, but by simply declining year after year to pick it up. The 29th of July had been declined for 30 years. And then a 13-year-old, who had no particular reason to know the date mattered, decided on his own that it did. George is Diana's eldest grandchild. He was born almost 16 years after she died. He never met her. He has no memory of her voice or her face. Nothing beyond the same photographs the rest of the world has. Sit with that gap for a moment, because it matters. To George, Diana is not a person he lost. She is a figure from before he existed, as historically distant to him as a great-grandparent. Someone who lives entirely in old footage and in the way his father's face changes when her name comes up. There is no obvious reason a boy that removed from her should feel anything particularly sharp about her at all. And yet what he carried into that garden the evening before the anniversary has a history far older than either of his parents, and far older than the marriage it is tied to. Before getting to what he did and what it did to William and Anne, you have to understand what that small green thing in his hand actually was. Because that is where this stops being a sweet story about a boy and a flower and becomes something the family is now quietly reckoning with. The flower was myrtle, and myrtle is not random. It is not decorative. It is one of the most loaded traditions in the entire royal wedding record. Since 1858, every royal bride has carried a sprig of myrtle in her wedding bouquet. The tradition began with Princess Victoria, Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, using cuttings from a myrtle bush that is still growing today in the grounds of Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. The custom has a specific mechanic to it. After each wedding, a cutting from the bride's own sprig is sent back to Osborne and replanted. The bush that supplied Charles and Diana's wedding in 1981 is, in a real sense, the same living plant that later supplied Catherine's bouquet in 2011. A continuous green thread running through every royal marriage for over a century and a half. The royal historian Hugo Vickers has written that the myrtle tradition is one of the very few pieces of wedding ritual to survive, largely unnoticed into the modern era. overshadowed by tiaras and headlines, but unbroken since Victoria's day. Unbroken regardless of how any individual marriage actually turned out. Diana carried a sprig of that myrtle in 1981. The marriage failed. The myrtle tradition did not care. It kept going, wedding after wedding, quietly outlasting every divorce and every scandal the family produced. And that detail matters enormously for what George did with it. Myrtle goes back to the ancient world. It was sacred to Venus and appears in wedding rites across centuries and cultures. It is an evergreen, which is the whole point. It does not die back in winter, it stays green. When Queen Victoria's family started planting it and replanting it and carrying it bride to bride, they were not simply choosing a pretty sprig. They were choosing the one plant whose meaning is love that does not fade and continuity that survives the seasons. That is a genuinely poetic thing to sit at the center of this story, because the marriage it is tied to here is the one that most spectacularly did not survive. Charles and Diana are the great counterexample. The wedding the whole world watched, and the divorce the whole world watched too. And the flower from their wedding is an evergreen that refuses to die. Follow the mechanics of that continuity because it is genuinely remarkable once you trace it through. The same root system, the same living organism, has fed a sprig into the hands of bride after bride for 165 years. Victoria's daughter down through the generations. Diana in 1981, Catherine in 2011. Different women, different marriages, some happy, and some catastrophic, all of them holding a cutting from the same plant. It is, in the most literal sense, the one physical thing that connects every royal bride across the entire modern history of the family. And a 13-year-old just reached into that unbroken chain and pulled out a link for his dead grandmother. Nobody had ever done that before. In 165 years, that flower had only ever gone to weddings. George sent it to a grave. Diana's memorial statue has stood in the sunken garden at Kensington Palace since the summer of 2021. When it was installed, the whole garden was replanted deliberately to reflect the colors of Diana's wardrobe. It is a thoughtful, personal space. But that garden has no connection to the myrtle tradition. None. There is no ceremonial link, no precedent, nothing written down anywhere that would tie a wedding flower to a memorial garden. The myrtle belongs to weddings. The statue belongs to mourning. For 5 years, those two things sat in completely separate worlds inside the same palace. That gap is worth staring at a moment longer, because it is not simply an oversight. It is a small, precise map of how the family actually holds Diana's memory. On one side, the joyful ritual, the myrtle, the weddings, the continuity, the parts of the story the institution is willing to celebrate. On the other side, the memorial, the grief, the ending, nobody wants to discuss in specific terms. The family had kept those two things carefully, deliberately apart, because bringing them together means acknowledging the thing they had spent 30 years not acknowledging. That the woman in the memorial garden was once the bride carrying the myrtle. That the celebration and the tragedy are the same person. Adults find that unbearable, so they keep the two rooms separate and never walk between them. It took a child who did not know the rooms were supposed to stay separate to carry the flower from one to the other and quietly put them back together. There is no official confirmation of the exact chain of events that placed that sprig in George's hands. According to Hello magazine, which first reported the detail, the myrtle did not come from Osborne House. It came from much closer to home. A cutting kept inside Kensington Palace's own walled garden, grown from stock descended from the same original plant, and normally reserved for family weddings, not memorials, weddings. Nobody has explained on the record how a request for it reached the gardening staff, or who authorized cutting a wedding flower for a garden that has never hosted a wedding. But the request came, and it was granted, Somebody in that walled garden was asked to cut a wedding flower for a memorial. Whoever received that request could have said no, could have flagged it, could have sent it further up the chain the way palace staff are trained to do with anything unusual. Instead, somebody quietly said yes and cut it and handed it over, which tells you that whoever they were, they understood immediately that this was not a request to be questioned. You do not need a memo to recognize when something matters. Somebody in that garden recognized it and made the small, unrecorded decision to let it happen. And that anonymous yes is the first quiet act in a story that turns out to be full of them. A whole chain of people, from a gardener to a future king, to a princess, to a reigning monarch, each one quietly choosing not to stop it. A source close to the household says George's interest did not begin with the anniversary at all. It began weeks earlier. He came across a photograph of his grandmother on her wedding day and asked his father a simple question. What was she holding? Just a boy looking at an old picture, asking about the thing in his grandmother's hands. And William, according to that same account, did not just answer him. He arranged the myrtle himself. No equerry, no private secretary, no press office. The heir to the throne quietly made sure his son could have a sprig of that same myrtle from that same lineage to answer a boy's curiosity about a photograph. What that actually is deserves a moment. That was the future king, acting entirely on his own initiative, without telling a single person paid to manage the family's image, putting the first crack in almost 30 years of official silence about his own parents' marriage. He did not announce it, did not clear it, did not treat it as anything other than a father answering his son's question. And to understand why that is significant, you have to understand William's whole relationship to his mother's memory, because it is the emotional engine underneath everything he does. This is a man who was 15 years old when Diana died. 15. He walked behind her coffin on foot through the streets of London with the entire planet watching, and held himself together while he did it because that is what the institution required of him. A boy performing composure at his own mother's funeral. A thing like that does not heal over and vanish. It stays. It becomes the quiet architecture of the man you become. Since then, William has been fiercely, almost silently protective of how Diana is remembered. Not through grand public tributes, but through control, keeping her memory close and out of the machine he has never fully trusted. So when his own 13-year-old son looks at a photograph and asks an innocent question about a flower, William is not just answering a kid's curiosity, he is watching the next generation reach toward the mother he lost. He arranged that myrtle quietly off the books, because that is how he handles anything to do with her. Privately, protectively, on his own terms, away from the press office. What he did not anticipate was what George would do with it. Because here is the thing about giving a thoughtful child a piece of something sacred. You do not get to control what it becomes. 2 days later, on the evening of the 28th of July, with no press notified and no photographer present, George is reported to have walked into the sunken garden with a single protection officer and knelt at the base of his grandmother's statue for less than a minute. He did not leave the myrtle on the plinth where flowers are normally placed, where they would be seen, where they might be photographed. He pressed it into the soil at the statue's feet, low down, where a visitor the following morning would have to know exactly where to look to find it. Then he stood, said nothing anyone recorded, and left the way he came. Think about that choice. A 13-year-old, at the age when children tend to crave to be seen, deliberately hid his gesture in the one place it would almost certainly go unnoticed. He was not doing it for a camera. He was not doing it for approval. He did it because he thought it should be done. And that instinct to make the private gesture rather than the public one is one of the most Diana things about the whole story. Consider what it would have been easy for him to do instead. He is 13. He is the future king. He has grown up inside a world where every gesture is potentially a photograph, where the family's love is constantly performed for an audience because that performance is part of the job. He could have left the myrtle on the plinth. Let it be seen. Let it become a lovely image the palace could have quietly acknowledged. That is the version that serves the institution. He did the opposite. He put it in the soil at her feet, in the spot where it would almost certainly never be noticed, which means he was not performing anything. He did it purely as a thing between him and a grandmother he never met. There is something almost unbearably tender about a child that, age understanding on instinct, that the realest gestures are the ones nobody is supposed to catch. That is not a lesson you can teach a child. That is simply who he is. What was going through the mind of a boy standing at that statue, pressing a flower into the earth for a woman he never knew? He has no memories of Diana. He cannot miss her the way William misses her, because you cannot miss what you never had. Was it grief inherited second-hand, absorbed from a father who carries it everywhere? Was it something closer to duty, a sense that this person matters to his family and therefore deserves something? Or was it simply the uncomplicated instinct of a kind child who saw a gap where his grandmother should have been and decided to fill it with the one meaningful thing he had? Nobody knows. He knelt there alone and said nothing, anyone recorded. One person did know where to look. By a route nobody at the palace has ever explained, the detail reached Hello magazine. Think about how tightly held this was. No press notified, no photographer, a boy, and a single protection officer at dusk, and a flower pressed low into the soil where you would have to already know it was there to find it. This was about as private as anything gets inside that family. And yet it surfaced. Not the whole story at first. Just the detail, the myrtle, the spot. Somebody who knew talked. This is not the kind of leak that damages anyone. If anything, it is the kind that makes the family look human in the best possible way, which suggests it came from someone who was moved by it. Someone who thought a gesture this quietly beautiful should not disappear entirely into the dark. Whoever they were, the story's better for the fact that they made that choice. Now to what happened when the adults in that family found out. It was Anne, according to those close to the household, who first understood what she was looking at. Of course it was. Anne is the one member of that family who genuinely knows what myrtle means, who grew up inside the tradition, who understands that a sprig of it is not a flower, but a vow, a piece of every royal wedding stretching back to Victoria. When word reached her that George had taken wedding myrtle from the walled garden to Diana's statue, she did not need it explained. A 13-year-old had reached back 165 years into the family's own ritual, pulled out its single, most sacred wedding symbol, and given it to the grandmother whose wedding the family had spent 30 years refusing to remember. Nobody taught him to do that. Nobody suggested it. He found the meaning himself. There's no public record of what was said when William and Anne spoke about it. What the people around them describe is simply the sequence of what happened, and it tells you more than any quote could. William had arranged the myrtle for his son as a small private kindness, a way of answering a boy's question about a photograph. He had expected George to keep it, maybe press it in a book. He had not expected his son to carry it alone to Diana's feet and press it into the earth as something given back to her. And when he understood what George had actually done, the full weight of it, the deliberateness of it from a boy who never got to meet her, his composure went. This is a man who walked behind his mother's coffin at 15 in front of the entire world and did not break. A sprig of myrtle in the soil, placed by his own son, is what finally undid him. And in a way, that makes complete sense. The thing William has quietly feared his whole adult life, the fear that runs beneath everything he does around Diana's memory, is that she fades, that she becomes a name, a photograph, a chapter in a documentary, less and less real with every year that passes. He was 15 when she died. His children never met her. Biologically, statistically, the memory of Diana should be thinning inside that family with every generation. That is simply what time does. And then his son, the one who by any measure should feel the least connection to her of anyone, turns out to feel it the most vividly. Vividly enough to act on it alone, unprompted, in a garden at dusk. For William, that is not simply touching. That is the answer to the exact fear he has been carrying since he was a boy. Proof that she is not fading, that she made it across the gap into a generation that never knew her, intact. There's almost nothing on earth that would break a person more completely than that particular relief. What those tears carry is not grief exactly. It is something closer to gratitude that hurts. Anne was right there in it with him. The two of them, arguably the most disciplined and least demonstrative adults in that entire household, both trained since childhood to keep the face still regardless of what is happening behind it, reduced to tears by a gesture from a 13-year-old. For Anne, it landed in a slightly different place, and it is worth separating. William's tears belong to a son, the relief that his mother made it across the years. Anne's are something else. She is the keeper of the traditions, the one who has spent her whole life defending the idea that these old rituals still mean something, even as the modern world treats them as quaint. She has carried the weight of continuity when almost nobody else in the family seemed to take it seriously. And here is a 13-year-old, the future of the whole institution, reaching entirely unprompted for the single oldest and most sacred wedding tradition the family has, and using it to honor the dead. For Anne, that is not just moving. It is proof that the things she has guarded her whole life are not dying with her generation. The tradition she thought she might be the last to truly understand just showed up, fully alive, in the hands of a boy 3 generations down. If you have given your whole life to keeping a flame lit, watching a child pick it up on his own is the thing that finally breaks you. What Charles did the next morning is, in its own restrained way, just as much of a revelation. He was told before his official engagements began. According to a source who spoke to the Daily Mail, he did not say much at all when he heard it. He asked one question about exactly where, at the statue's base, the myrtle had been left. Then he said nothing else on the subject for the rest of the day. What he did instead tells you everything. He cleared an appointment that had been on his diary for weeks and went to the sunken garden himself, alone except for a single protection officer, on the morning of the 29th of July. The anniversary. That is not a small thing. On the surface, it sounds like a king standing by a statue for a few minutes before breakfast. In reality, Charles has never been photographed at his former wife's memorial since it was unveiled in 2021. Not on an anniversary, not on her birthday, not once in 5 years. Camilla was not there. No statement was issued. No court photographer had been briefed because none had been told to come. The only reason the visit is known about at all is that staff happened to be tending the same garden that had supplied the myrtle 3 days earlier, and they described a man standing completely still for far longer than the visit strictly required, his hands in his coat pockets, looking not up at the statue's face, but down at a patch of soil, at the exact spot where his grandson had pressed a wedding flower into the earth. To understand the weight of Charles specifically going there, you have to understand what that memorial represents for him. His relationship with Diana is the single most scrutinized, most publicly dissected part of his life. He was cast, fairly or not, as the villain of the most famous marriage of the 20th century. Every documentary, every anniversary, every interview pulls him back to it. And Camilla, the woman he loved and eventually married, the woman a substantial part of the country still associates with the whole trajectory of that marriage, sits at the center of that story. A public visit to Diana's memorial is not a simple act for Charles. Go and you invite 100 headlines about guilt and grief and what it means for his wife. Stay away and you look cold. For 5 years, he chose to stay away and let the silence do what silence does. And then his 13-year-old grandson quietly rearranged the whole situation. After what George did, staying away was no longer neutral. The boy had reached toward Diana with both hands. For Charles to maintain his distance in the face of that would have meant something, and he knew it. So he went early, before anyone was up. No cameras, no Camilla, no statement. The most private version of the visit it was possible to make. He stood there looking not at the sculpted face of his former wife, but down at the earth where a child had buried a wedding flower. And he said whatever he said to a woman he married 45 years ago, divorced 15 years into it, and lost roughly a year after that. A marriage the palace spent almost 30 years declining to discuss was finally acknowledged, quietly, without a single word for the record, by the two people who lived it and the one who never got the chance to. Nothing about this was coordinated. That is exactly what makes it hold together. George's request started with a photograph, not an instruction. William's help started with a father answering his son's question, not a plan cooked up by anyone paid to manage the family's image. Anne's reaction was not staged for anyone. There were no cameras in the room where she broke down. And Charles's visit came a full day after the fact, once he already knew what had happened without him, with nothing left for him to arrange, only somewhere to stand. 3 generations of that family, a generation apart from each other, all arriving separately at roughly the same instinct. Remember her. Not one of them waiting for the other two to go first. You cannot manufacture that. It only happens when the feeling underneath it is real. Almost everything this family does in public is on some level produced. The walkabouts, the wreath layings, the carefully composed anniversary portraits. There's a team behind all of it. A schedule, approval, a photographer positioned at exactly the right distance. There is nothing wrong with that. It is the job. But it does mean that genuine, unmanaged emotion inside that family is almost never something the public gets to witness, because the machinery catches it first and smooths it into something presentable. What makes this story different is that the machinery was not there. No press office touched George's gesture. No photographer captured William and Anne's faces. No court official arranged Charles's morning visit. Every beat of it happened outside the apparatus, which is exactly why it feels like the truest thing this family has done in years. Someone in the comments of an earlier video asked whether anyone in this generation of royals actually feels anything for Diana, or whether it is all just image management at this point, keeping her name alive because she is useful to the institution. The cynicism is understandable. So much of what we see is managed. But this is the answer to that question. A 13-year-old buried a flower where no camera would ever find it. 2 of the most controlled adults in Britain wept when they heard. A king cleared his mourning to stand alone in the soil. None of it was for us. None of it was for the brand. If that is brand management, it is the worst targeted campaign in history, because it was designed at every step to never be seen. The family's relationship with the 29th of July was never actually resolved by 30 years of silence. It was only paused. The grief did not go away because nobody mentioned it. It sat there waiting for someone young enough not to know he was not supposed to touch it, and that someone turned out to be the future king at 13, with a flower he had asked his father about after seeing an old photograph. Diana carried that myrtle sprig into a marriage. Her grandson carried the same lineage of plant to her grave. She carried it forward into a life. He carried it backward into a memorial. Same plant, same family, 165 years of continuity, and one very quiet 13-year-old deciding entirely on his own that the thread should not be allowed to break just because the marriage did. The myrtle was always supposed to represent love that outlasts the seasons. That was the whole reason the Victorians chose an evergreen. For Charles and Diana, the love did not outlast the marriage. It cracked in public and ended in a tunnel in Paris. The symbol appeared to fail, except it did not quite. The love the myrtle was supposed to carry did not survive between husband and wife, but it survived somewhere else entirely. It jumped a generation. It landed in a grandson who never met her and loved her anyway. The evergreen kept its promise, just not in the direction anyone expected. The marriage died. The love, it turns out, is still green. And it took a 13-year-old with a flower to show the family that it had been alive the whole time, waiting in the one place none of them had thought to check. Some things do not heal because you stop mentioning them. They just wait for the right person to finally say them. Or in George's case, to say them without a single word at all.